Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The Negro Question and Jim Crow. In it, I'll provide a usable definition for the purpose of this class for Jim Crow. I'll discuss Black empowerment during Reconstruction, federal abandonment of African American rights from about 1874 to 1898, and the interconnected ways that white society and the law in the United States created the caste system of Jim Crow through racial terrorism as well as legislation. Defining Jim Crow is difficult because there's no common definition and because it's such an emotionally charged issue that it's difficult to get sufficient quote-unquote historical perspective on it. Indeed, we have never actually stopped arguing about the social and legal positions of race in our pluralistic body politic here in the United States. It's also difficult to define because we tend to conflate personal racial bigotry with institutionalized power. As Stokely Carmichael, who later took the name Kwame Ture, is credited with saying, quote, "If a man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is not a question of attitude, it's a question of power," unquote. Some people argue that Jim Crow began in the immediate aftermath of the US Civil War and either has not let up or has revived in the 21st century. Others maintain that the Jim Crow era began in earnest in the 1890s, was very intense into the 1910s, then lasted into the 1970s, but do not argue that white supremacy ever went away, though they do argue that it was suppressed as a matter of law after the 1970s. For the purposes of our class, let me offer this definition and keep it focused on institutionalized power. Jim Crow used informal social power and formal state power to establish a racialized social and political order. That is, it established the quote-unquote place of African Americans vis-a-vis white society in the aftermath of Reconstruction. It established a racialized caste system and relied on the coercive power of the state to establish via legislation and court decisions white civic supremacy and Black civic inferiority. Where the law could not regulate this racial caste system, Jim Crow relied on personal and social power to enforce white supremacy. During the era of Jim Crow proper, the so-called nadir of race relations in the US between about 1890 and about 1915, we see the withdrawal of federal governmental protections of African American rights, the rise of racial terrorism, and the deliberate use of race consciousness to interfere with developing class consciousness among workers, and state statutes and local ordinances used to solidify this new civic order, again, that we call Jim Crow proper. Laws after about 1915 refined and adjusted or added new dimensions to the racial caste system that was established during Jim Crow proper. Jim Crow was a response of white supremacists to the sudden empowerment of African Americans against the wishes of all but the most progressive white people during Reconstruction. Jim Crow took into the late 1880s to manifest beyond personal bias when the federal government removed the legal protection it had provided Black Americans since the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. Jim Crow occurred in the US South most prominently because the vast majority of African Americans lived there into the 20th century. Only with the great migrations of the 1910s and later did Blacks move to northern and western cities in appreciable numbers. When they did, those cities sometimes passed ordinances but usually allowed private business people to enforce segregation. The white-dominated press began to call racial issues, quote-unquote, the Negro question around the turn of the century. This so-called Negro question asked, what will we as white society firmly attached to white supremacy, do to ensure that Black Americans do not continue to enjoy the rights they took and were guaranteed during Reconstruction and in the decade after. Remember, Reconstruction was the era that not only liberated the enslaved, but also provided Blacks with personal freedom, legal equality, and civil rights, even though it wasn't necessarily realized as perfectly as the law pretended it was. Of course, this was not a perfect system, and both personal racism and socially institutionalized white supremacy did not allow African Americans to enjoy the rights that the law, in all of its majesty, proclaimed existed. But Jim Crow developed in reaction to the fear caused in white society by the federal government formally guaranteeing, such as it was, that Blacks had equal rights with whites. Postbellum Black liberation and the legal equality was founded on both the federal government and Black initiative. The foundation of federal support were the three so-called Reconstruction Amendments to the U.S. Constitution that concerned the place of freed peoples as citizens, which was a new status. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except for punishment for crime, which is an issue that comes up later. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868 after the Supreme Court threatened the Civil Rights Act of 1866, established birthright citizenship and made it clear that the rights and restrictions of the U.S. Constitution applied to the states as well as the federal government. Last is the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, that guaranteed Black men had the right to vote. The U.S. Congress also passed legislation to counter actions by southern states to reimpose conditions similar to slavery on African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 beat back the new slave codes passed by a number of states in 1865 that were, indeed, replicas of the old slave codes in how thoroughly they restricted even the rudimentary freedom of Blacks. That same year, led by the radical Republicans, that is in 1866, Congress threw out President Johnson's mild presidential reconstruction that had re-empowered Confederate elites, and just about threw Johnson out too. They passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 that divided the South into 5 military districts governed by military governors who kept former Confederates from dominating state politics through violence. States could ease the yoke of military oversight by conforming to the law. This was the era of so-called carpetbaggers and scalawags in various state legislatures. We'll talk a bit about Black legislators in a moment. With South Carolina in particular, balked at treating its Black citizens who made up the majority of the population as citizens and used racial terror to secure elections. Congress passed the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871 to suppress Ku Klux Klan activity and similar activities. Now, the last act I'll mention is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It required Blacks to receive equal treatment in public accommodations, transportation, and jury service. This followed many local legislatures passing similar laws at the state level that were difficult to enforce without congressional help. There's a line of argument that postulates that the enslaved liberated themselves and that the 13th Amendment codified what had already occurred. This line of reasoning comes from examination of local history rather than only national history. In Reconstruction, we see that Blacks seized the initiative to empower themselves, and I'll skim over 3 ways that happened. First, Black leaders ran for political office when the vote was protected by federal military occupation and even before. Although the old notion that Southern legislatures were dominated by formerly enslaved has been punctured thoroughly, it's true that Black representatives and their Republican Party allies dominated the Reconstruction state legislatures for a few years. These legislatures were reviled in later history as being corrupt and overspending the Treasury, but that too has been punctured by looking at the corruption and spending patterns as well as the anti-black rhetoric of previous state legislatures and later state legislatures. What Reconstruction legislatures did was to spend money on internal improvements such as railroads and on spreading education across the faces of their state. Those legislatures that followed wheeled back spending on public benefits, though they tended to keep propping up railroad companies. By the end of the Civil War, African Americans had developed a tradition of race-based political conventioneering called the Colored Convention Movement. It began in the free states in the 1830s and spread into the former slave states until about 1900. Activists met in local, regional, state, and even national conventions to discuss politics and to support black civil life and civil rights. Even more so, individual people sought freedom, often by moving from place to place to search for family members in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War or later for better economic opportunity. Groups formed too that ran parallel to white society. Except in the most restrictive places like the Mississippi Delta, blacks formed official militia companies. The 3rd Alabama Militia is an example of this, founded black towns, and established flourishing business districts in larger cities throughout the South. This latter is to say that there was more than one Black Wall Street, which we'll hear about in relation to Durham, North Carolina, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, as well as other places in our next lecture. Beginning in 1870, so-called Redeemer governments began replacing Reconstruction legislatures and Republican office holders at the state level. Proudly and openly white supremacist, which actually comported with common Northern attitudes, these Southern governments saw a return of Confederate veterans, former plantation owners, and new businessmen and farmers who proclaimed the vision of the so-called New South, including not only economic cooperation with the North, but also that Southern whites were best able to conduct racial affairs themselves. Remember, almost the entire African American population of the U.S. lived in the former Confederacy until the Great Migrations of the 20th century. Thus, Northerners had no dog in the fight, as we might say, concerning African Americans and became content to let white rule return. Redeemer governments replaced the short-lived Reconstruction biracial legislatures of blacks, carpetbaggers, that is, Northerners who had come south for economic and political position, and scalawags, that is, Southerners who became Republicans. The new Redeemer governments were solidly of the Democratic Party and usually called themselves the Conservative Party. In the 1890s, much of Jim Crow disfranchisement was implemented in order to stabilize the Democrats' hold over all state offices. When the party was assured through disfranchising the reliable Republican votes of black men, it could allow its factions to fight with one another without the threat of losing office. The last 3 states to remove their Republican and biracial governments were those of South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, all of which had been very recalcitrant in race relations.